So by now you've had a chance to take a look at downward pick slanting as a technique, maybe been able to put in some time experimenting with it, experience a little bit of the mechanical efficiency in concert with chunking, another topic from the first episode of season 2. So now we're going to take kind of a step backwards and talk about something which for years we thought was sort of the fundamental of picking technique, or perhaps even the entirety of picking technique, and that is a topic I call motion mechanics. And very simply what I mean by this is the method you use for moving the pick back and forth. Now this is kind of funny, right? You would think that is picking technique. What else could there be? But as we're discovering, the process of solving the mechanical puzzle of picking is really about pulling it apart into its components and being able to recognize the fact that this is a multifaceted problem and that simply moving the pick around isn't actually going to get you there. In fact, if that were the case, we would have gotten there decades ago. We've been having this discussion, generally speaking, among guitar players and teachers about moving the pick using particular mechanical methods. This is a discussion we've been having for decades, and it never helped us play with the kind of fearful precision and accuracy that you see in players like John McLaughlin or an Yngwie Malmsteen. And so we should have figured this out a long time ago, that this wasn't where the answer was. This was a concept that I began to dimly feel, I think, at some point in high school, where I started to feel like there was a missing link, but I didn't quite articulate it to myself that way. And there did come a point, probably at some point between high school and college, maybe right around that juncture. In fact, if you've watched Cracking the Code, the show, in season 1, I lost this guitar contest. Quite spectacularly lost this guitar contest by playing television theme songs to a bunch of drunk metalhead fans. And it went over really well among the other competitors on stage who were all music nerds. And then nobody in the audience out in Long Island in like 1990, no one got this. They were all just totally wasted out of their mind. And either way, for me, this was sort of a pivotal moment. I was dejected. I felt like this was a thing I was supposed to be good at, and yet here I am having to admit to myself that I was not quite the player that I thought I was. And it was at that point when the switch sort of flipped in my mind, and I thought, you know what, there's a thing here. I don't suck this bad normally, right? So arrogance is perhaps the mother of invention and necessity, right? Arrogance is the mother of investigation, right? We need a reason to go in search of a thing. And sometimes understanding that a thing is a problem is the first most important step, right? If you don't know there's anything to look for, you don't go looking for it. And this was the problem in guitar for so long. We just thought, well, some players have it and others don't. And, well, you just hold the pick a particular way and move it really fast, and if you're a genius, it'll work out, right? Thankfully, that's not the case. And it was in my own mind, when I finally took the step to realize that there probably was a thing that we weren't getting. At least there was a thing that I wasn't getting. And I had to go in search of this. And that's when the problem began to separate, kind of like in a solution, where certain things began to fall out, where I realized, okay, you know what, the moving of the pick, that's one thing, but there's something else, there's some missing link. And of course, that ended up being downward pick slanting. It ended up also being chunking. And it turns out if you think about picking technique in this componentized way, there are many components of it. There's anchoring, where you tend to touch part of the guitar with your hand as a point of tactile reference. There's pick slanting, there's edge picking, another really important concept where most players do this. They use a little bit of the edge of the pick against the string to change the tone and also to make it easier to pick back and forth across the string because the pick doesn't get stuck anymore. But this idea of how you actually move the pick, this turns out to be just one of these 6 components of picking technique. So the motion mechanic, then, is both fundamental and yet not as critical as we once perceived it to be. Nevertheless, it is a thing that we should look at because it is one of these areas that has been spoken of with such superstition and reverence, like almost as though you're born to be using a particular method for doing this. And players become very superstitious about this. Well, no, I do it this way and he does it that way and we're different. Well, here's my assertion, and I would admit up front that there's a way probably to test this assertion, and we need more testing. Opinions are a thing that we need to start to dispense with. We need to move into the realm of investigation and testing. But my assertion is that most players can use most motion mechanics, whether it's wrist or elbow or all these different methods of moving the pick back and forth. My assertion, this is what I would like to believe, because it seems the most logical, is that given the enormous physical variety of players, the different packages that we all come in, and from the Paul Gilbert, 6'4", super skinny, to the Al Di Meola, who's just smaller, more compact. In fact, for that matter, myself, Eddie Van Halen, somewhere in between, Zakk Wylde, somewhere in between. everybody is built in so many different ways, and yet we don't see an infinite number of motion mechanics. The methods that players use to move the picks back and forth really fall into a few basic categories. And so it is my guess that we can all learn all of them. And so far in my own playing, I haven't yet met one that I wasn't able to figure out with a certain amount of work. And there are, in fact, several that I personally use in the process of playing different styles, playing different types of licks. And so one thing which I can recommend you take a look at, there's a YouTube video that we posted to the channel not too long ago called 4 Essential Motion Mechanics. And it'll give you a look at some of the motion mechanics that I personally use in my own playing. And this is pretty cool because, again, this is a subject that my thoughts on this subject have evolved over the years. I would not, let's say 20 years ago, have had this understanding of these different methods of moving the pick back and forth. And I am sure that 20 years from now, I will have even more detailed thoughts on the subject, and hopefully another 3 or 4 of these things in my toolkit that I can actually utilize for different kinds of playing. For example, you'll see in that video I talk about finger motion, which is a thing that Yngwie is sort of famous for doing, and to some extent Derek Johnson. And that's not a thing that I really do right now. It's more of the thing that I'm working on. And maybe at some point I will crack that code and figure out how finger motion works, and it'll become something that I actually use for specific effects or at specific times in my playing. So 4 Essential Motion Mechanics is cool because it gives you a close-up look using the magnet slow motion camera mount. You can actually see what these things look like. It's very, very clear. And I talk about the Michelangelo Badio method there, 2 variants of a rotational method, which are sort of Yngwie style, kind of, and then a finger-based method. Next thing you can look at is a chapter that we put in our Volcano seminar. This is the Master's Mechanics seminar about Yngwie's technique. And this was one of the later chapters, and we call it the Rotational Mechanic. And this is roughly an overview of Yngwie's motion mechanic. Now, Yngwie is a very special case. He's a very interesting case because Yngwie's approach to moving the pick back and forth is really quite sophisticated. It's not really one thing or another. It's really a blend. So Yngwie is sort of famous for using a certain amount of his fingers to move the pick. But it's also clear from watching him that there's a rotational component, which is really a forearm type movement. And so in this video chapter, we talk specifically about the rotational component of this. It's more like the finger thing is sophisticated, but what we're really trying to do here is give someone who wants to experiment with a specific new motion mechanic a very clear and concise method for actually doing it, so that we dispense with as much of this superstition as possible. And again, the method that Yngwie uses, or let's just say this rotational method in general, is straightforward enough that I can't really imagine someone not being able to do it. Sure, you may have a way of moving the pick now which is different, but I would like to think that everyone could probably do this if they spent a fair amount of time working on it. And the point here is really to give you an option, right? So there's that motion mechanic. And then in similar fashion, we wrote a Guitar World article about that lesson, which you can check out. It's the Yngwie Malmsteen rotational picking mechanic. And we have a description of pronation and supination, which are the actual hand movements involved, or the actual forearm movements involved in executing that movement. Finally, you can take a look at the code archive. This is a fantastic selection of clips from interviews that I've done with amazing players, where I actually brought the first version of the slow motion camera that I had developed on the road and met up with players like Michelangelo Badio, Rusty Cooley, Albert Lee, Tommy Emanuel, just a host of incredible players, Mike Stern. And we have some clips of these interviews up on the website in a section called the Code Archive. And in particular, if you take a look at the Rusty Cooley section, what's unique about Rusty is he actually has multiple motion mechanics. And this is an important concept. Many players, it is extremely common for players to have more than one way that they move the pick. You'll notice Eddie Van Halen is sort of famous for his eruption-style tremolo, where he does this flying thing with the fingers. But then when he's doing more sort of garden variety riffing, it's more of an elbow thing sometimes, and then he does more of a rotational thing. Looks totally different. It's really pretty amazing, but these differences are so obvious that we should have zeroed in on this perhaps a long time ago, and they're highly idiosyncratic, and we have to wonder, well, why does he do the one in the one case and not in the other? Well, in Rusty's case, the rotational method is used for highly articulate playing, when he needs to do complicated things across the strings. The clip you can check out is called the Inside Pedal, where he does this pedal tone lick that moves back and forth between 2 strings using inside picking. He hits one note on the top string and immediately comes back and plays the other string. It's expertly done. Then, to take a look at Rusty's higher speed mechanic, which I call the Hyperdrive Mode, you can take a look at the Lydian 6-note motif clip, where it's his elbow mechanic. This is an elbow technique that he uses, and he reaches stratospheric speeds. It sounds amazing. It's incredibly aggressive and really precise for these really high-speed single-string type lines where you just need raw speed, and the tone he gets is this combination of aggressive and smooth. It's really pretty fascinating. The point of all this is not to say that you need to do any of these things. Really, my whole concept is that we should be able to use as many of these as possible. They all work. All these great players do these things. The point of investigating these is really just to give you options.